نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. واكتب لنا في هذه الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة إنا هدنا إليك قال عذابي يصيب به من أشاء ورحمتي وسعت كل شيء فسأكتبها للذين يتقون ويؤتون الزكاة والذين هم بآياتنا يؤمنون. Respectful honorable friends, to the verses that we are doing, as it's been a while, as this the verse that is recited to you was the last verse that we had done in the weekly Tafseer just before the night before the beginning of Ramadan. If you recall, in this ruku as well as the previous ruku, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had been mentioning of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu salam, and this had been part of a sequence wherein Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been mentioning to us various incidents of the previous Anbiya alayhi salatu salam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, but the surah itself began with Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam. And then after some rukus, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned Nuh alayhi salatu salam. And then we had done Sayyidina Hud alayhi salam, Sayyidina Shu'aib alayhi salam, Sayyidina Lut alayhi salatu salam. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned with regards to Musa alayhi salatu salam, and the mention of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu salam had been over a larger section of verses compared to the other Anbiya that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. And as I had mentioned to you at the time, that the purpose for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioning the tazkirah, the incidents of the previous Anbiya, is so, one, that Nabi Kareem sallallahu ta'ala sallam gains some hope and encouragement from the incidents of the previous Anbiya, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give Nabi encouragement, knowing that he isn't the only one who has been persecuted by his followers, but all the Anbiya that came in the past, they also undertook and underwent great hardship and difficulty by the followers. So by this it gives Nabi Kareem sallallahu alaihi wasallam encouragement. Yes, we Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for when ordaining the fast, had mentioned to us, كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. Now this fast has been, that the fast of Ramadan are ordained upon you just the way they were ordained on those before you. So by mentioning ordained on those before you, to give us encouragement that those in the past would also fast, and fasting was ordained upon them as well. And that's the way they managed to fulfill this command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then those after them should be able to fulfill this command as well. So for encouragement, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the incidents of the previous Anbiya alayhi salatu salam to give Nabi Kareem some encouragement. And for us and the followers, and for the reciters of these verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us ibrah. He gives us lesson in it. Lesson, because in the verses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to us the plight who disobeyed the Nabi of the time, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had punished them. And also the reward of those people who followed the Anbiya, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded them, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved them from the punishment. Although at the time the followers of the Anbiya were those who were lesser in number, they were also weaker. It was the Umara, the rich, the leaders who were against the Nabi, and they were under that misconception that because they themselves are leaders and they are of the wealthy, so they will be spared and saved from any form of punishment. But when the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at a person's appearance, He doesn't look at the social standings of anybody. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at the iman of an individual, and and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished the disbelievers and He saved the believers. So irrelevant of who they were. And if it so happened that the believers were the weak and the poor, it was they who were saved. And leaders who were the rich and the disbelievers who were rich and the leaders, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed them. And they were destroyed because they were the ones who had disobeyed and rejected the teachings of the Nabi of the time. So in it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the ibrat and lessons for those who follow and those who don't follow. And in the process we did the azab of Fir'aun, we did the azab of all the nations of the time, the Ad and Samud, who were mighty powers and had great strength. But despite that, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had destroyed them. So again, all of these, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned these things, is not as form to give us lessons on history, or for us to read various incidents and stories of the previous Anbiya, but it is there for us to take heed and take ibrat from these incidents. For that reason we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not mention the incidents of the Anbiya in great detail. We don't have an entire chapter solely on the history of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu salam, another chapter on the history of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, Sayyidina Nuh and Lut, because the purpose of the Quran is not a historical book, and neither is the Quran a story book that we can entertain ourselves and pass time reading the incidents and stories. For that reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions incidents at various places in the Quran, and that so very briefly as well, so that we do not divert from the actual purpose of the Quran. And the actual purpose of the Quran is Hudal Linnas, that it is a guidance for mankind, and part of the guidance for mankind is to know a bit of what happened in the past, as well as how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mainly to do with how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dealt with those people, those who believed and those who did not believe, so that we take lesson from these things. Because ibrat, taking lesson, which is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the Quran tells us, فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ وَفَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Take ibrat, take heed, take lesson. Absar, people with sight; albab, those who have reason and those who have intellect. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to us, فَاعْتَبِرُوا, for us to take heed. So any such incidents that occur, whether in present times as well, such incidents occur, we take ibrat from it. Similarly, incidents of the past, we take ibrat from it, we take heed and we take lesson. And an intelligent person, that's what Allah Ta'ala mentions, who takes heed? Ulil absar and ulil albab. The people of sight, only they are the ones who will take ibrat. Otherwise, other people who do not have albab, they in today's time, they'll be more busy of what? Taking their mobile phones out and filming and whatever takes place and then putting that on YouTube, rather than them seeing an incident and taking ibrat from that incident as to what has happened. Somebody dies in front of you, or he's dying in front of you. At that time, that is a time of ibrat for us to take heed from that moment that it is his turn, tomorrow it will be my turn as well. But instead of us taking heed from it, we will rather be taking our phones out, filming, so that we can put on YouTube that this is a scene of somebody. This is a scene of somebody who has just died, or this is a scene of somebody who just had an incident or so. Whereas these things are such a, we're supposed to be taking ibrat from it, a lesson from it, and not sort of just using filming these things and taking it lightly and as a form of entertainment. But it is only the ulil absar and the ulil albab, the people of sight and the people of intellect, who will take heed to such matters. And albab, those who have intellect, who look at these things and use their aql on it and to take lesson from it. Absar, those who have sight. Obviously sight, everybody has sight. But now the sight of somebody who's dying, one is the sight of that person who gets fun out of it or buzz out of seeing somebody dying there. And the other is that person who looks. But his looking is not for the sake of this dunya looking, of just looking and that's it, and getting some entertainment from it. But his looking is for the sake of him taking lesson from it and heed from it, and looking beyond that which is just in front of him. So that is the Subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to us incidents of the previous Anbiya. Now coming back to the verse that I've recited to you. Now this verse, we had actually done the entire verse in the last tafseer that we had before Ramadan, but it is actually just the ending part of it, that at that time I just sort of whisked through the translation of the ending part, that I would like to cover again because it is relevant to us before we start the next verse. In the mention of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, we had done all the story incident from of Firaun, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had destroyed Firaun and saved the Banu Israel. And then in between, the kufr of the Banu Israel, the taking of the calf, the Samiri, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam the Torah and that. These were the various verses that we had done. The verse recited to you in which Allah, Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, is making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in which he says, وَاكْتُبْ لَنَا فِي هَذِهِ الدُّنْيَا حَسْنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ إِنَّا هُدْنَا. That Allah just do the translation of it and then move to the actual section that we need to be doing. وَاكْتُبْ لَنَا, and ordain for us and write for us, فِي هَذِهِ الدُّنْيا, in this world, حَسْنَةً, goodness, وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ, and also in the hereafter, إِنَّا هُدْنَا إِلَيْكَ, because we have hudna ilayk, we have ruju, we have turned towards you. قَالَ أَذَابِ أُصِيبُ بِهِ مَنْ أَشَاءُ وَرَحْمَتِي وَسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ. In the verses prior to this was where, when Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam had returned with the Torah, wherein there were those from the Banu Israel who had then claimed that, okay, fair enough, this is, you saying this is Torah, but how do we know this is the Torah? And we won't believe until we do not hear it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this is the Torah. So they actually wanted to hear it. So Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam had taken 70 people there. And then again when they heard it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they wanted to now see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually فَأَخَذَتْهُ الرَّجْفَ, punished them. And Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam then had asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. And asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to revive them, because otherwise if he goes back without these 70 people, then the Banu Israel will then say that Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, because he himself had no proof, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could not, didn't speak to him, and these people didn't see or something. So Musa alayhi salatu wasalam must have just got rid of these people. So Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam feared this, knowing what type of nation he was sent to. So out of fear for this, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to punish them and rather just forgive them. On the other hand, he had mentioned and he had made dua that Allah grant us fi dunya hasana, goodness, virtue in this world and in the hereafter. Inna hudna ilayk. And قال عذابي أصيب به من أشاء ورحمتي وسعت كل شيء, to which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that my punishment أصيب به من أشاء, it is inflicted upon whoever I desire, ورحمتي وسعت كل شيء, and my mercy encompasses each and every single thing. And I mentioned to you at that time the meaning of rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then in the same verse, the end section of it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions سَأَكْتُبُهَا لِلَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ بِآيَاتِنَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. That when Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam had asked from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of hasana, goodness in this world, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not accept that on behalf of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. The reason being is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to grant that hasana to the ummah of Nabi Kareem sallallahu ta'ala wasallam. So for that reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not directly reply by saying that that is granted to you.